Edmund Ashbourne fell to the floor of his own dining hall before the second course had even been served. His fork was still in his hand when his body gave way. The crystal glass in front of him shattered against the marble, and for a moment, no one at the long table moved. His mother, Lady Margaret Ashbourne, simply stared, as though the sight before her belonged to someone else's son. His younger brother, Julian, rose halfway from his chair, then sat back down, unsure of what to do with his own hands. It was a footman who reached him first, loosening the cravat at his throat while Edmund's breath came in short, uneven pulls. By the time the physician arrived, the great house on Ashbourne Hill had gone silent in a way it had never been silent before. Servants spoke in whispers. Candles were lit earlier than usual, as if darkness itself might be kept from finding him. Edmund lay in his bedchamber upstairs, pale against the white linen, while Dr. Alan Prescott examined him with the same grave patience he might have shown a man already gone. "It is a wasting sickness," the doctor said at last, closing his bag with a soft click that seemed far too loud in the quiet room. "I have seen it twice before. It takes the strength first, then the breath. I cannot tell you how long. Weeks. Perhaps months, if he is strong. I am sorry, Your Grace." Lady Margaret did not weep. She thanked the doctor with the practiced calm of a woman who had spent her whole life keeping her face still in front of others, and she showed him to the door herself. It was only when she returned to the hallway outside her son's room that her hand trembled against the wall, just once, before she straightened her shoulders and walked on. Clara Whitfield heard all of it from the servants' stairwell, where she had been carrying a stack of pressed linens meant for the guest wing. She was 17 years into a life that had never once belonged only to her, first as an orphan taken in by the old Duke's charity, and now as one of a dozen housemaids who kept the halls of Ashbourne swept and quiet. She was not meant to know the family's private grief. She was meant to be invisible, the way good servants were trained to be. But she had known Edmund Ashbourne since he was a boy of 10 and she a girl of 9, both of them small and out of place in a house too grand for either of their beginnings. He had been the son of the man who had saved her from the workhouse. And now he was dying, and the house was already beginning to arrange itself around his absence rather than his survival. She set the linens down outside his door and did not go in. It was not her place. Instead, she waited, the way she had learned to wait for most things in her life, until someone told her what was needed. No one did. The house moved around Edmund's illness like water around a stone, adjusting, flowing past, never stopping. 3 days later, Lady Margaret announced that the family would be leaving for the countryside estate at Fenwick, where the air was cleaner and the surroundings gentler on the nerves. She spoke of it at breakfast as though it were the obvious and only sensible course, and no one at the table asked the question that hung over all of them, which was whether Edmund would be coming too. He would not. The physician had advised against travel in his condition, and Lady Margaret accepted this advice with a swiftness that suggested she had been hoping for exactly that answer. Julian said nothing at all, only stirred his tea and stared at the tablecloth. Lady Eleanor Vance, Edmund's betrothed of nearly a year, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief and murmured something about how difficult this all was for everyone, as if the difficulty were evenly shared. Clara stood near the sideboard, refilling cups no one had asked her to refill, and watched the family decide, without ever quite saying it aloud, that they would go on living their lives in a house 40 miles away, while the man who made their comfortable lives possible lay dying alone in this one. The morning the carriages left, Clara stood at the top of the servants' stairs and watched through the tall window as trunk after trunk was loaded onto the waiting coaches. Lady Margaret climbed in first, followed by Julian, and then Lady Eleanor, who paused at the door for one long moment and looked back up at the house, at the window she knew belonged to Edmund's room, before she, too, disappeared inside the carriage. No one went up to say goodbye to him. Clara realized this with a cold, sinking certainty as the wheels began to turn on the gravel drive. Not one member of his family had climbed those stairs to sit beside his bed, even for a moment, before leaving him behind. She found Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper, in the linen room an hour later, sorting through instructions that had been left for the reduced staff who would remain. Most of the household would travel with the family, or be sent to other duties. Only a handful of servants were to stay at Ashbourne Hill to keep the house running for its absent master. "Who is caring for his grace?" Clara asked, and she heard the sharpness in her own voice before she could soften it. Mrs. Doyle did not look up from her ledger. "The valet will look in on him, and a nurse has been engaged from the village, though she comes only in the afternoons." "Only the afternoons," Clara repeated. "That is what has been arranged, Clara. It is not our place to question the family's decisions." Clara said nothing more, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like insolence, and insolence could cost her the only home she had ever known. But that evening, when her duties for the day were finished and the other maids had gone to their quarters, she climbed the stairs to the family wing instead of her own, and she stood outside Edmund's door for a long moment before she knocked. There was no answer. She pushed the door open slowly and found him lying exactly as she had imagined him, alone, the fire burned down to embers, a pitcher of water on the table beside his bed that had clearly not been touched in hours. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, and when he turned his head toward the sound of the door, she saw how much thinner his face had become in only a handful of days. Clara. His voice was rough, unused. He tried to push himself up against the pillows and failed, and something in her chest twisted painfully at the sight of it. You should not be here. It is not your place. No one else is here, she said simply, crossing the room to the hearth to add another log to the dying fire. So I suppose it will have to be my place tonight. He watched her with an expression she could not quite read, something between shame and relief. They have gone to Fenwick. I know. My mother says the air will do them good. I know that too. She poured fresh water from the jug on the washstand into his cup and held it to his lips, and he drank because he had no strength left to refuse the small kindness, even if some part of him wanted to. Drink slowly. You will make yourself sick again if you rush it. I am already sick, he said, and there was something close to a laugh in it, dry and without humor. Then you have nothing left to lose by listening to me, she answered, and for the first time in days, something in his face eased, just slightly, at the sound of her voice speaking to him as a person rather than a patient or a duty. She stayed longer than she should have that night, longer than any servant was meant to stay in a nobleman's private chamber, straightening the blankets, coaxing the fire back to life, making certain the water beside his bed was full before she finally slipped back down the stairs to her own small room beneath the eaves. She told herself it was only decency, only the plain human instinct to not leave a suffering creature entirely alone in the dark. But lying awake that night, staring up at the low ceiling of her narrow room, Clara understood with a clarity that frightened her that she had just made a choice. The family had gone. The house had emptied itself of everyone who owed Edmund Ashbourne their love, their loyalty, their presence. And somehow, without deciding it in any grand or deliberate way, she had decided to stay exactly where the rest of them had refused to remain. In the morning, she rose before dawn, dressed in her plain gray uniform, and climbed the stairs to his room before her official duties even began, carrying a tray of bread and warm broth she had prepared with her own hands in the kitchen while the cook still slept. She did not know yet how long this sickness would last, or what it would cost her to keep climbing those stairs every single day. She only knew that someone had to, and that no one else in that vast, echoing house seemed willing to be the one. The valet, a quiet man named Peter, found her there that first morning and said nothing about it, only nodded once as though some silent agreement had passed between them. He had his own duties to attend, matters of correspondence and appointments that no longer mattered much to a man too weak to leave his bed, and he seemed grateful, in his own reserved way, that someone else had taken up the harder task of simply sitting with Edmund through the long hours of the day. The village nurse came at 2 in the afternoon, exactly as arranged, and left again at 5, exactly as arranged, checking his pulse and his breathing with brisk efficiency, before returning to her own family across the fields. She was not unkind, only limited by the terms of her employment, and Clara understood that the gap between 5 in the evening and whenever morning finally came again belonged to no one but her, if she chose to claim it. She did choose it night after night, though she told no one, not even Mrs. Doyle, the full truth of how much time she spent in that room. She learned the rhythms of his illness the way she had once learned the rhythms of the house itself, which fires needed tending, and which floors creaked beneath careless feet. She learned that his fever rose worst in the deep hours before dawn, that he slept better with the window cracked open despite what the doctor had advised, that he hated being spoken to as though he were already a dead man, though everyone else in his life seemed to have already begun speaking of him that way. A letter arrived from Fenwick on the 4th day, addressed to him in his mother's careful hand. Clara brought it up with his broth and watched his face as he read it, watched the way his jaw tightened before he set it aside without finishing. She writes that the countryside suits Julian's nerves, he said quietly, not quite looking at her. That the change of air has done wonders for everyone's spirits. Clara did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, only reached out and adjusted the blanket at his shoulder, and he let her, closing his eyes as though the small gesture cost him less pain than any words could have offered. By the 2nd week, Ashbourne Hill had become a house of two entirely different worlds sharing the same walls. Below stairs, the reduced staff kept to their tasks with the brisk efficiency of people who understood, without being told, that they were now managing a house that had quietly stopped being a home. Above stairs, in the master's wing, Clara Whitfield had built a small, fierce routine around a single purpose: keeping Edmund Ashbourne alive until his family remembered they had left him behind. She was not trained for it. No one had taught her how to change the linens of a man too weak to lift himself from the bed, or how to coax broth past lips that had lost the will to eat, or how to read the small, silent signs that told her his fever was climbing again before the numbers on the physician's thermometer ever confirmed it. She learned by watching, by trial, by the plain, stubborn will of someone who had decided that failure was not a possibility she was willing to accept. The village nurse, a brisk woman named Grace Fenmore, began to notice the change in her patient within days. "You have been doing more than sitting with him," she said one afternoon, eyeing the neatly changed dressings on Edmund's arm, where the physician had drawn blood the week before, a treatment that had left the skin raw and prone to infection if not properly tended. "Who taught you to bandage a wound like this?" "No one," Clara admitted. "I watched you do it, the first day. I only tried to remember." Grace studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes. "Well, you remembered well." She did not offer praise easily, Clara had learned, so the words landed with more weight than they might have from anyone else. "If you are going to keep doing my work for me in the evenings, you had better let me show you properly, so you do not do more harm than good." And so began an unlikely arrangement, unspoken and unofficial, in which the village nurse used her afternoon hours not only to tend Edmund but to teach Clara, showing her how to read his pulse against her own fingers, how to recognize the difference between ordinary exhaustion and the deeper, more dangerous kind that meant his body was beginning to fail. Clara absorbed it all with a hunger that surprised even her, staying late into the evening long after Grace had gone home to her own family, practicing the small, careful movements until they became instinct. Edmund watched all of this unfold from the vantage point of his pillows, too weak most days to do more than observe, but observe he did, with a growing and uncomfortable awareness of the gulf between what this young woman gave him freely and what his own family had chosen to withhold. "You should not be spending your evenings like this," he told her one night, when the fever had broken just enough to let him speak in full sentences again. "You have your own life, your own hours, when your work is done." "This is my work," Clara said simply, wringing out a cloth in the basin beside his bed and pressing it gently to his forehead, or near enough to it. "It is not. I have seen the roster. Your duties end at 7. "Then I suppose I have taken up a hobby," she said, and something in the dryness of her tone startled a real laugh out of him, brief and rusty from disuse, but real all the same. It was the first time she had heard him laugh since the night he collapsed at dinner, and the sound of it settled something in her chest that she did not examine too closely. He grew curious about her in the quiet hours between fevers, the way a man confined to a bed for weeks on end grows curious about anything beyond the walls of his own room. He asked about her childhood, and she told him, carefully at first and then with more ease, about the workhouse where she had spent her earliest years, about the day his father, the old Duke, had come through on some charitable errand and taken notice of a small girl too proud to beg for scraps. "He gave you a place here," Edmund said. "I remember him speaking of it, though I was too young then to understand what it meant." "He gave me everything," Clara said quietly. "A roof, food, a trade to learn. I owe this family more than I could ever repay, Your Grace, and I do not intend to forget it now, simply because it has become inconvenient for others to remember." The words carried an edge she had not quite intended, and she saw him flinch slightly at the implication buried inside them, the unspoken comparison between her loyalty and his family's absence. She almost apologized, then decided against it. It was true, and he was not a fool. He knew exactly what she meant. Letters continued to arrive from Fenwick, growing shorter and more infrequent as the days passed. Lady Margaret wrote of dinners and visitors and Julian's improving spirits. She mentioned Edmund's health only briefly, always in the same detached, hopeful language, trusting that the physicians were doing all that could be done, praying for his swift recovery, as though prayer from 40 miles away could substitute for a hand held beside a sickbed. Lady Eleanor's letters were fewer still, and thinner in substance, filled with talk of the weather and the countryside and very little of the man she had promised to marry. Clara read them aloud when Edmund's eyes grew too tired to focus on the page himself, keeping her voice carefully neutral, though she felt the sting of each careless line almost as sharply as she imagined he must. She does not ask when I might recover, Edmund observed quietly one evening, after Clara had finished reading the latest of Eleanor's brief notes, only how the roses are faring in the Fenwick garden. Perhaps she does not know what to say, Clara offered, though she did not fully believe it herself. Perhaps she has already stopped imagining a future in which I am part of it, he said, and the flatness in his voice told her he had already made peace with a truth he had not yet spoken aloud to anyone else. Clara did not answer that. There was nothing kind she could say that would not also be a lie, and she had decided, somewhere in the long nights of that first fortnight, that she would not lie to him, not about this, not about anything. It seemed to her the one honest gift she still had left to offer a man who had been fed nothing but polite, comfortable falsehoods by everyone else in his life. The physician returned twice more that week, each visit shorter than the last, each departure leaving behind fewer words of encouragement. Dr. Prescott was, Clara had come to understand, a man who had already decided the shape of this story, and was simply waiting for events to confirm what he believed he already knew. He spoke to Clara now more than he spoke to Edmund, as though the patient himself had already become a formality, and he left instructions for comfort rather than treatment, the quiet language of a man preparing a household for loss. Clara refused to accept it, though she said nothing of her refusal aloud. Instead, she began asking questions Dr. Prescott seemed unwilling to answer. She asked Grace Fenmore, during the nurse's afternoon visits, whether there were other physicians in the county who might see the illness differently. Grace hesitated before answering, glancing toward the closed door, as though the walls themselves might carry gossip back to the family at Fenwick. "There is a man in the next county," Grace said finally, lowering her voice. "Dr. Colton. He trained in London, and again abroad, in places most of our local men have never even heard of. He has strange methods. Some call them foolish, but I have heard it said he has saved patients that other physicians had already given up as lost." Clara turned this piece of information over in her mind for the rest of that evening, long after Grace had left, and the house had settled into its nightly quiet. She sat beside Edmund's bed, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, and made a decision that frightened her with its own boldness. She would not simply nurse him through whatever time Dr. Prescott believed he had left. She would find another answer, even if it meant stepping far outside the narrow boundaries of what a housemaid was ever meant to do. She did not tell Edmund yet. He had enough weight pressing down on him already, between his failing body and his family's absence, and she did not want to offer him hope that might, in the end, prove as hollow as everything else that had been promised to him since the night he collapsed at his own dinner table. But that night, before she finally allowed herself to sleep, she wrote down the name Grace had given her on a scrap of paper and tucked it carefully into the pocket of her apron, where it would stay until she found the courage and the means to act on it. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to the servants' entrance, a young man named Nathaniel from the Fenwick household staff, sent ahead with a fresh delivery of correspondence and instructions for the reduced staff at Ashbourne. He lingered in the kitchen over a cup of tea, glad of the company after his long ride, and spoke freely of life at the Fenwick estate in a way that made Mrs. Doyle's mouth tighten with disapproval, though she did not stop him. "They are planning a small gathering for the end of the month," he said, buttering a thick slice of bread. "Lady Margaret has already sent for musicians. Lord Julian seems in fine spirits these days, riding out most mornings with Lady Eleanor, the two of them thick as thieves." Clara, who had come down for a fresh pot of broth, stood very still in the doorway at those words. She saw the flicker of unease pass across Mrs. Doyle's face, quickly smoothed away, and understood that the housekeeper had heard whispers of this before. Whispers she had chosen not to repeat to anyone above stairs who might carry them further. "Riding out together," Clara repeated carefully, keeping her voice light, as though the words meant nothing to her at all. "Every morning, weather allowing," Nathaniel said, oblivious to the sudden tension in the room. "Lady Margaret seems quite pleased by it. Says it does them both good, to have company their own age while things are so unsettled here." Clara said nothing further, only finished filling her tray and carried it back up the stairs, her mind turning over the small, careless detail Nathaniel had offered without any understanding of its weight. She did not yet know what it meant, whether it was simple friendship born of shared grief and shared boredom in the countryside, or something else entirely. But she filed it away, the way she filed away every small fact in that house, understanding instinctively that knowledge, however painful, was always better held than avoided. She did not mention it to Edmund that evening. He was tired, his color poor after a difficult afternoon, and she judged, rightly or wrongly, that this was not the moment to burden him with rumors carried by a stable hand over buttered bread. Instead, she read to him from a battered novel she had found in the library downstairs, her voice low and steady in the quiet room, until his breathing finally evened into sleep and she could sit alone with her own thoughts. It was during these quiet hours, after he had drifted off and before she allowed herself to seek her own narrow bed, that Clara did her clearest thinking. She turned the name Dr. Colton over and over in her mind, weighing the risk of writing to a stranger against the far greater risk of doing nothing at all, while Dr. Prescott's grim predictions, slowly, quietly, became true. She had little money of her own, only the small wages saved carefully over years of service, but she began to calculate, in the dark, exactly how much a letter might cost to send, and how much more it might cost to bring a physician from another county to a house whose mistress had not authorized any such expense. It was a foolish plan by any measure. She had no authority to summon physicians on behalf of a duke. If Lady Margaret discovered what she intended, it could easily be seen as an overreach far beyond a servant's place, grounds enough for dismissal, or worse. But each night, sitting beside Edmund's bed and watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, weighing the fragile thread that seemed to be all that held him to the world, Clara found she cared less and less about what might happen to her if she was caught, and more about what would surely happen to him if she did nothing. By the end of that second week, she had made up her mind fully. She would write the letter herself, in careful, borrowed language she hoped would not betray her lack of formal education, and she would find some way, through grace or through her own meager savings, to see it delivered. Whatever came of it, whatever risk it carried for her own small, precarious place in this world, she would not sit quietly by and watch this family's absence become the final word on Edmund Ashbourne's life. She rose before dawn the next morning, sat at the small writing desk crammed into the corner of the linen room, and began, and crossed out, and began again, until she had a letter she thought might do. It was plain and honest, and it asked for nothing more than a visit, a second opinion, a chance. She sealed it with the little wax she could find, addressed it in her careful hand, and hid it beneath the false bottom of her small wooden trunk, waiting for the courage, and the opportunity, to send it on its way. Lady Eleanor Vance arrived at Ashbourne Hill without warning on a gray Tuesday morning, her carriage sweeping up the gravel drive as though she meant to make an entrance rather than a visit. Clara saw her from the upstairs window and felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she could not have said exactly why. She had grown used to the quiet rhythm of the empty house, to being the only steady presence in Edmund's world. The sudden reappearance of his betrothed felt, absurdly, like an intrusion, though Clara knew she had no right whatsoever to feel that way. She helped Edmund sit up against a fresh set of pillows, smoothed the blanket over his legs, and stepped back into the shadows near the door just as Lady Eleanor swept into the room in a cloud of traveling perfume, her gloves still on, her expression arranged into something that resembled concern but did not quite reach her eyes. "Edmund," she said, crossing to the bed but stopping a careful distance from it, as though illness itself might be catching through proximity alone. "You look well. You look tired." "I am tired," he said. And Clara heard the flatness in his voice, the same tone he used with the physician now, polite and utterly without warmth. "It has been 3 weeks, Eleanor. I know it has. It has been dreadfully difficult for all of us." She finally perched on the edge of a chair a full arm's length from the bed, arranging her skirts with unnecessary care. "The whole county is talking of it, you understand. People ask after you constantly. I hardly know what to tell them." "You might tell them the truth," Edmund said, "that I am dying, slowly, in a house my family has mostly abandoned." Eleanor's face flickered with something that might have been genuine hurt, or might simply have been embarrassment at being spoken to so plainly in front of a servant. Her eyes cut briefly toward Clara, standing near the door, and something in her gaze sharpened, assessing, before she looked back to Edmund. "That is unfair," she said. "Your mother writes to the physician weekly. She has done everything a mother could do from a distance." "From a distance," Edmund repeated quietly. "Yes, that is precisely the problem, Eleanor. Everything is being done from a distance." A silence stretched between them, uncomfortable and thick, until Eleanor finally reached for a new subject, the way a drowning woman reaches for driftwood. "The gathering at Fenwick is set for the end of the month. Small, of course, given the circumstances, but your mother felt it important to keep some semblance of normal life going, for Julian's sake, if nothing else. He has taken all of this very hard, you know." "He hardly sleeps." "He hardly sleeps," Edmund echoed, and something in his tone made Clara look up sharply from where she stood. There was an edge to it now, something that had not been there a moment before. "I have heard he rides out most mornings." "That does not sound like a man who cannot sleep." It sounds like a man who has found other ways to occupy himself. Eleanor's composure cracked, just slightly, just for an instant, before she smoothed it back into place. I am sure I do not know what you mean. I think you do, Edmund said, and though his voice remained quiet, there was a new steadiness in it that Clara had not heard from him in weeks. I think you know exactly what I mean, Eleanor, because I suspect you have been riding out beside him. The silence that followed was different from the one before it, sharper, more dangerous. Eleanor rose from her chair with careful, deliberate slowness, drawing her gloves tighter over her fingers, as though preparing for battle rather than retreat. You are unwell, Edmund. The illness has made you suspicious of everyone, even those who love you best. Does it love me best? He asked, because from where I am lying, it looks a great deal like everyone who claims to love me best has found excellent reasons to be 40 miles away. She did not answer that. She gathered her skirts, murmured something about a headache brought on by the journey, and left the room without so much as glancing at Clara, who remained standing quietly by the door until the sound of the carriage wheels finally faded down the drive. Edmund sat very still for a long time after she had gone, staring at nothing in particular, his hands loosely folded in his lap. Clara crossed the room slowly and refilled his water glass, uncertain whether he wanted company or silence, and settled for offering both, sitting nearby without speaking, letting him find his own way through whatever storm was moving behind his eyes. You heard all of that, he said finally. It was not a question. I did. And do you believe it is true, that she has been riding out with Julian every morning? Clara considered lying, considered offering him the small mercy of doubt, and found that she could not do it, not after everything she had already promised herself about honesty being the one true thing she still owed him. I heard it from one of the Fenwick servants, only a few days ago. He spoke of it as though it were common knowledge in that household. I did not know whether to tell you. Edmund closed his eyes, and for a moment Clara feared she had made a terrible mistake, that the truth had cost him more than he had strength left to spend. But when he opened them again, there was something clearer in his expression, something almost like relief, the particular relief that comes from finally having a suspicion confirmed, rather than continuing to carry the exhausting weight of uncertainty. Thank you, he said quietly, for not lying to me. Everyone else in my life seems intent on managing what I am allowed to know. You have never once done that. I promised myself I would not, Clara admitted. It seemed the least I could offer you, when I could not offer much else. You have offered me a great deal more than you realize, he said, and something in the way he looked at her then made her cheeks warm, made her look away toward the fire, rather than hold his gaze a moment longer. That night, after he had finally fallen into a restless sleep, Clara sat alone in the small chair beside his bed and allowed herself, for the first time, to think clearly about what she had witnessed that day. She thought of Eleanor's careful distance from the bed, as though grief itself might be contagious. She thought of the sharp, assessing look Eleanor had given her, and wondered, with a small uncomfortable jolt, whether the other woman had somehow sensed the shift that had happened in this house over the past 3 weeks, the quiet, unspoken bond that had formed between a dying duke and the housemaid who refused to leave his side. She told herself it did not matter what Eleanor suspected, or did not suspect. Her only task was to keep Edmund alive, to see him through whatever days or weeks remained, regardless of what his family chose to do or say from their comfortable distance in the countryside. But some small, honest part of her admitted, in the privacy of that quiet room, that her feelings toward him had shifted into something she had not intended, something that went far beyond the loyalty she owed his father's memory. The next morning brought a letter of a different kind, this one addressed not to Edmund but to Clara herself, left discreetly on the kitchen table by a boy who had ridden in from the village and departed again before anyone could ask his business. Mrs. Doyle eyed the letter with open suspicion as she handed it over, but said nothing, and Clara carried it up to her small room to read in private before her duties began. It was from Grace Fenmore, brief and to the point, informing her that Dr. Colton had agreed, after some persuasion, to travel to Ashbourne Hill the following week to examine the Duke himself. Grace had taken it upon herself, it seemed, to deliver Clara's carefully written letter in person rather than trust it to the post, understanding better than most the delicate nature of what was being asked and the risk it carried for a servant acting without her mistress's knowledge or consent. Clara read the letter twice, then a third time, her heart beating fast against her ribs. It was one thing to write the words down in the quiet of night, safely theoretical, a plan that existed only on paper. It was another thing entirely to know that a stranger, a physician with methods some called foolish, would soon be standing in Edmund's room, offering an opinion that might contradict everything Dr. Prescott had already told the family to expect. She did not know how she would explain his presence if Lady Margaret returned unexpectedly, or if word somehow reached Fenwick before she had a chance to prepare Edmund for what she had done. She only knew that she had set something in motion now, something that could not easily be undone, and that whatever came of Dr. Colton's visit, she would have to find the courage to see it through, whatever the cost to herself. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, beside the small worn photograph of the old Duke she had carried with her since childhood, and went to wake Edmund for his morning broth, her mind already turning over the delicate task of finding the right moment, and the right words, to tell him what she had done in his name without ever once asking his permission. She found him already awake, propped against his pillows, watching the pale morning light move slowly across the ceiling. He turned his head as she entered, and something in her face must have betrayed the weight of what she was carrying, because his brow furrowed with immediate concern. "Clara, what is it? You look as though you have seen a ghost." "Not a ghost," she said, setting the tray down carefully and taking a steadying breath. "A physician. I have written to a man in the next county, without your knowledge or your mother's, and he has agreed to come and examine you next week. I should have asked you first. I am sorry. I did not know how, and I feared you might refuse before you had heard why." For a long moment, Edmund said nothing at all, and Clara braced herself for anger, for the sharp reminder that she had overstepped every boundary a servant was meant to respect. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, and thick with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "You did this. For me. I could not simply watch Dr. Prescott write you off as a lost cause without at least trying for another answer," she said, the words tumbling out faster now that the confession had begun. "I know it was not my place. I know I had no right, but I could not sit beside you every night and do nothing more than wait for the worst, when there might be another way." Edmund reached out, slowly, and took her hand in his grip weaker than it should have been, but steady all the same. "No one else in my life," he said, "has fought this hard for me. Not my mother, not my brother, not the woman who is meant to marry me. You alone have refused to let me simply fade away in this room, and I do not know how I am ever meant to repay a debt like that." Clara did not trust herself to answer. She only tightened her fingers around his and let the quiet moment stretch between them, filled with a fragile, dangerous hope neither of them dared to name aloud just yet. The days that followed carried a strange new energy through the quiet rooms of Ashbourne Hill, as though the house itself had begun holding its breath in anticipation. Clara threw herself into preparation with the same fierce determination she had brought to every other task since the night Edmund collapsed, scrubbing the room until it shone, laying in fresh linens, arranging for the fire to be kept generously stocked against the physician's expected arrival. She told Mrs. Doyle only that a colleague of Dr. Prescott's had been asked to consult, a version of the truth thin enough to hold if no one pressed too hard against it. Mrs. Doyle, to her credit, asked no further questions, though Clara caught her watching with a considering expression more than once that week, as though the older woman understood far more than she let on and had chosen, for reasons of her own, not to interfere. Edmund's spirits lifted in a way that worried Clara almost as much as it pleased her. He spoke of the future now in small, tentative ways he had not allowed himself to before, wondering aloud whether he might one day walk in the gardens again, whether his strength might return enough to ride, to travel, to resume some version of the life that had been so abruptly stripped away from him. Clara encouraged this hope while privately bracing herself against the possibility that Dr. Colton's methods, whatever they proved to be, might offer no more certainty than Dr. Prescott's grim predictions had. Julian arrived unannounced 2 days before the physician was due, riding in alone on a lathered horse that suggested he had pushed the animal hard the entire way from Fenwick. Clara heard the commotion below stairs and hurried down to find him standing in the front hall, still in his riding coat, his face flushed with something between anger and worry. "Where is my brother?" he demanded of the first servant he saw, and Mrs. Doyle stepped forward quickly to direct him upstairs before his raised voice could carry further through the house. Clara followed at a discreet distance, uncertain what had prompted this sudden visit, and arrived at Edmund's door just in time to hear Julian's opening words, sharp and accusing. "I have heard the strangest rumor, Edmund, that some quack physician from beyond the county line has been summoned to examine you, without mother's knowledge, without anyone's knowledge, apparently arranged by one of the servants." His eyes flicked toward Clara, standing in the doorway, and something cold settled into his expression. "This one, I assume." "Her name is Clara," Edmund said, his voice steady despite his brother's tone. "And yes, she arranged it. Because she cared enough to try something other than simply waiting for me to die. Do you understand what people will say if word of this spreads? A housemaid, making medical decisions on behalf of the Duke of Ashbourne, without the family's consent? It makes us look like fools, Edmund. It makes it look as though none of us are managing your care at all. None of you are, Edmund said flatly. That is precisely the trouble, Julian. You are all 40 miles away, managing your own comfort, while a servant girl has done more for me in 3 weeks than my own family has done in 3 months. Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment Clara thought he might argue further, might insist on sending her away before the new physician ever arrived. Instead, something in his brother's steady, unflinching gaze seemed to give him pause, and he sank slowly into the chair beside the bed, some of the anger draining out of him and leaving something more uncertain in its place. I did not mean for it to look this way, Julian said quietly, after a long silence. I did not intend to abandon you, Edmund. I simply did not know what to do. I have never watched anyone die before, and I did not know how to sit in this room and watch it happen to you. So instead, you rode out every morning with my betrothed, Edmund said, and the quiet bitterness in his voice made Julian flinch visibly. That is not what you think it is. Then tell me what it is. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again, and in the silence that followed, Clara understood that whatever answer he had been about to give was not one he was prepared to say aloud. Not yet. Not with her standing there as a witness to it. He left shortly after, promising vaguely to return before the new physician's visit, and Clara watched him ride away with a troubled feeling she could not quite name, some instinct warning her that this was not the last complication his return to Fenwick would bring. Dr. Henry Colton arrived at Ashbourne Hill on a bright, cold morning, stepping down from a modest carriage, with none of the ceremony Clara had half expected from a man Grace described as unlike any physician she had ever known. He was younger than Dr. Prescott, perhaps 40, with quick, observant eyes that seemed to take in the entire house in the span of a single glance as he crossed the threshold. He carried his own bag, refused the offer of tea before examining his patient, and asked Clara more questions in the first 10 minutes than Dr. Prescott had asked in 3 full weeks of visits. How long has he had difficulty breathing at night? Colton asked, climbing the stairs 2 at a time with an energy that left Clara half out of breath trying to keep pace. Does it worsen lying flat or sitting upright? Lying flat, Clara answered. He sleeps propped against pillows now, or not at all. And the swelling in his ankles, has it changed with the season, or does it seem constant regardless of activity? Clara found herself answering question after question with details she had not realized she had catalogued so thoroughly until this stranger asked for them. Small observations gathered over 3 weeks of sitting beside Edmund's bed, watching, adjusting, learning the particular language of his suffering. By the time they reached his door, Colton was nodding slowly to himself, already forming some private theory Clara could not yet guess at. He spent nearly 2 hours with Edmund, far longer than Dr. Prescott's usual brisk 15 minutes, listening to his chest from multiple angles, pressing gently at his abdomen, examining the color of his nails and the whites of his eyes with a thoroughness that seemed almost strange to Clara after weeks of accepting Prescott's grim, hurried pronouncements as the final word on Edmund's condition. When he finally straightened and closed his bag, his expression was thoughtful rather than grave, and something in that simple difference made Clara's heart lift with a hope she immediately tried to suppress, fearing the disappointment that might follow if she let herself believe too quickly. I do not think this is the wasting sickness your previous physician described, Colton said, addressing both of them at once, his tone measured and careful. The pattern of your symptoms, the swelling, the breathlessness when lying flat, the slow progression rather than sudden collapse, these point towards something else entirely. A weakness of the heart, most likely, brought on by some earlier illness your body never fully recovered from. It is serious, I will not pretend otherwise, but it is not, in my experience, always fatal, and it responds, sometimes remarkably well, to treatment that your Dr. Prescott may not have considered. Edmund stared at him for a long moment, as though the words themselves needed time to settle into meaning. You are saying I might live. I am saying it is possible, not certain. Nothing in medicine is ever certain, Your Grace, and I would be doing you a disservice to promise more than I can deliver. But I have treated cases with similar patterns before, and some of those patients are living still, years after physicians far more confident than I am had already given up on them. Clara had to grip the back of the nearest chair to steady herself, the sudden rush of feeling almost too much to bear standing upright. She had hoped, of course she had hoped, every single night she sat beside his bed, but she had not allowed herself to truly believe until this moment. hearing it confirmed by a man with no reason to offer false comfort to a servant and a dying duke in a mostly empty house. The treatment Colton proposed was demanding, and he was honest about that too, refusing to soften the difficulty of what lay ahead. There would be a strict new diet, certain foods eliminated entirely, others introduced in careful, specific quantities. There would be a tincture, bitter and unpleasant, taken 3 times daily, along with careful monitoring of his breathing and his pulse, to track whether his heart was slowly regaining its strength or continuing to fail. And there would be, hardest of all, weeks of enforced rest, no visitors permitted to tire him, no excitement or distress allowed to strain a heart still too fragile to bear it. Someone will need to manage all of this closely, Colton said, looking between Edmund and Clara with an assessing gaze that seemed to already understand more about their situation than either of them had explained aloud. Someone with him constantly, watching for any change, keeping careful record of his pulse and his breathing morning and night, ensuring he takes the tincture exactly as prescribed, and nothing that might counteract it. I understand the family is currently residing elsewhere. They are, Edmund said, but Clara has been managing my care since they left. She will continue to do so. Colton looked at Clara with new interest, as though reconsidering something about her. You have no formal training, I understand from Grace. And yet the details you gave me on the stairs were more precise than most nurses I have worked with managed to provide. He reached into his bag and withdrew a small leather notebook, pressing it into her hands. Write down everything, exactly as I instruct you. His pulse, morning and night, his breathing, whether it is easy or labored, any swelling, any change in color to his lips or his nails. I will return in a fortnight to assess his progress, but you will be his eyes and his voice in between, and I need you to be precise. Clara accepted the notebook with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the sudden weight of responsibility being placed so deliberately in her care, and yet steadied, too, by the quiet confidence in Colton's voice, the sense that he trusted her with this task not out of desperation but out of genuine belief in her ability to carry it. After Colton had gone, promising to send the tincture and detailed written instructions within the week, Clara sat beside Edmund's bed in a silence that felt entirely different from the heavy, waiting silences of the past 3 weeks. This one hummed with possibility, fragile and unfamiliar, and neither of them seemed to quite know what to do with it. You did this, Edmund said finally, echoing the words he had spoken days earlier, though his voice carried a different weight now. You found him. You brought him here, against every rule that governs your position in this house, and because of that, I have been given something I did not think I still possessed. A chance. Do not thank me yet, Clara said, though her own eyes were bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. We have weeks of hard work ahead of us, and Dr. Colton was honest that nothing is certain. But yes, we have a chance now, where before we had none, and I intend to make the very most of it. The weeks that followed tested Clara in ways nothing in her life had prepared her for. The tincture was as bitter as promised, and Edmund resisted it more than once, his temper fraying under the strain of the strict new diet and the enforced isolation from anyone who might tire him. Clara held firm against his frustration, with a patience that surprised even herself, coaxing, sometimes gently scolding, always returning to the same steady insistence that they had come too far now to abandon the treatment simply because it was difficult. She recorded his pulse each morning and each evening in the small leather notebook Colton had given her, tracking the numbers with a diligence that bordered on obsession, searching each measurement for any sign of change, any evidence that the treatment was working or, worse, that it was not. Some days the numbers offered little comfort, his pulse still too fast, his breath still too shallow when he lay back against his pillows. Other days, small victories emerged. A night he slept flat without waking, gasping for air. A morning his color seemed less gray against the white linen. Through it all, something between them deepened in ways neither had quite named aloud, forged in the shared intensity of fighting for his life together, night after night, with no one else in that vast house paying close enough attention to notice how much the housemaid and the Duke had begun to depend on one another for something far beyond the simple duties of care and service. Grace Fenmore continued her afternoon visits throughout this period, though her role shifted gradually from primary caregiver to something closer to a quiet mentor, checking Clara's notebook entries against her own observations, correcting small errors, praising the growing precision of her records. It was Grace who first noticed, nearly 3 weeks into the new treatment, that Edmund's ankles had stopped swelling entirely, a small victory that brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes when Grace pointed it out during one ordinary afternoon visit. You have done fine work here, Grace told her, packing away her instruments as the light outside began to fade toward evening. Better than many trained nurses I have known. Whatever happens next in this house, you should know that. Clara carried those words with her long after Grace had left for the evening, turning them over in her mind as she settled into her now familiar chair beside Edmund's bed. He was awake, watching her with the quiet attentiveness that had become their shared language over these difficult weeks, and when she caught his eye, something passed between them that neither yet had the courage to speak aloud. "You look tired," he said softly. "You give so much of yourself to this, to me. I worry sometimes that I am asking too much of you, that I have no right to keep taking from a woman who owes me nothing beyond what her position requires." "You are not taking," Clara said, settling into the chair and reaching for his hand out of habit now rather than any conscious decision. "I am choosing to give it. There is a difference, Edmund, even if it is not always easy to see from where you are lying." He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that had become familiar between them over these long weeks, though neither had ever spoken openly about what it meant. "I have had a great deal of time to think these past weeks. About my life before this illness, about the people I believed loved me, and the ways I measured that love, before I understood how little most of it was worth when it was truly tested." "And what have you concluded?" Clara asked quietly, though some part of her already feared, and hoped, she knew the answer. "That I measured it entirely wrong," he said. "That the people closest to me by blood or by promise offered the least when it mattered most, while a woman I had known my whole life, but never truly seen until now, gave everything she had without ever once asking for anything in return." Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she found she could not quite meet his eyes, suddenly acutely aware of how close their hands were, how the quiet room seemed to hold its breath along with her. "I did not do it for reward, Edmund. I want you to understand that." "I know," he said softly. "That is precisely why it means what it does." Neither of them spoke further that night of what might lie beyond the careful boundaries they had maintained throughout his illness, the invisible line between servant and master that Clara had been raised her entire life to never cross, no matter how deeply her feelings had grown to defy it. But something had shifted between them in that quiet exchange, a truth spoken aloud for the first time, even if neither yet had the courage or the certainty to say precisely what it meant, for whatever future might still lie ahead of them both. Dr. Colton returned as promised, exactly a fortnight after his first visit, and this time his examination brought a small, genuine smile to his usually measured face. He listened to Edmund's chest for a long while, checked the notebook Clara had kept with such careful diligence, and nodded slowly at what he found there. "His heart is stronger," he said. "Not fully recovered, and I would caution against any excitement of celebration just yet, but stronger, without question. Whatever you are doing, Miss Whitfield, you are to continue doing exactly that." He glanced toward Edmund, still propped against his pillows but with noticeably more color in his face than he had carried a fortnight earlier. "In another month, if this progress holds, we may begin considering short periods out of bed, careful ones. But it would be a start." The words settled over the room like sunlight breaking through a long winter, and Clara had to look away toward the window to hide the sudden rush of emotion threatening to overwhelm her composure in front of a man she still, despite everything, considered a stranger to their private world of quiet hope and careful record-keeping. After Colton departed, promising to return again in another fortnight, Edmund reached for Clara's hand once more, holding it with a new firmness that had not been there in the weeks before. "A month," he said. "A month, and I might stand again, walk again. All because a housemaid refused to accept what everyone else in my life had already decided was inevitable." "Do not celebrate too soon," Clara warned gently, though she could not fully suppress the smile tugging at her own lips. Dr. Colton was clear. Careful, small steps. Nothing more, not yet. "Careful, small steps," Edmund repeated, and something in the way he said it, looking at her rather than at the room around them, made Clara wonder whether he was speaking only of his recovering health, or of something else entirely that had begun growing quietly between them through all these long, difficult weeks. Word travels fast in a county where gossip is currency, and by the time 2 months had passed since Edmund Ashbourne collapsed at his own dinner table, the news of his recovery had reached Fenwick long before any letter arrived to confirm it officially. Clara learned of the family's imminent return from Mrs. Doyle, who received a hastily written note from Lady Margaret announcing that the household would be relocating back to Ashbourne Hill within the week, now that reports of Edmund's improved health had reached her. There was no mention in the note of the physician who had made that improvement possible, no acknowledgement of the housemaid who had spent 2 months of nights sitting beside his bed, while his own mother remained comfortably distant. "They are coming back," Clara told Edmund that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He was sitting up in a chair by the window now, a milestone Dr. Colton had permitted only a week earlier, and the added strength in his posture made the news land differently than it might have a month before. "Now that the danger has passed," Edmund said, his voice carrying an edge Clara had come to recognize over these past weeks. Quiet, but unmistakably sharp. "Now that there is a recovered Duke to return to, rather than a dying one to avoid, how convenient the timing is." Clara said nothing, unwilling to add fuel to a fire that was already burning steadily enough on its own. She had watched Edmund's feelings toward his family harden slowly over the weeks of his recovery, each letter from Fenwick chipping away a little more at whatever loyalty and affection had once bound him to them. She did not think that damage would be easily undone, whatever excuses Lady Margaret and Julian arrived prepared to offer. The carriages returned on a bright afternoon exactly 1 week later, the same gravel drive that had once carried the family away, now carrying them back, trunks and all, as though nothing of significance had happened in the 2 months between departure and return. Clara watched from an upstairs window, her heart beating unevenly, uncertain what this homecoming would mean for the fragile new world she and Edmund had built together in their absence. Lady Margaret entered the house first, already calling for Mrs. Doyle before her gloves were even removed, her voice carrying the same brisk, managing tone she had always used when addressing her household. She swept toward the stairs the moment she learned Edmund was strong enough to receive visitors, and Clara had only a moment's warning before the bedroom door opened, and Lady Margaret stood in the threshold, taking in the sight of her son sitting upright in a chair, color restored to his face, in a way that seemed to genuinely startle her. "Edmund," she breathed, crossing the room quickly and reaching for his hands. You look so much better than I dared hope. Dr. Prescott's last letter gave us so little reason for optimism. I confess I feared the worst on the journey here." "Dr. Prescott has not seen me in nearly 2 months, Mother," Edmund said, allowing her to take his hands but offering nothing warmer than polite tolerance in return. He would have no basis for optimism, or its absence. "I have been treated by a different physician entirely." Lady Margaret's brow furrowed with genuine confusion. "A different physician? Who authorized such a thing? I certainly did not." "No," Edmund agreed. "You did not. You were 40 miles away, managing your nerves in the countryside, while Clara took it upon herself to find someone willing to treat me properly, rather than simply prepare the household for my funeral." Clara, standing near the fireplace, felt Lady Margaret's gaze land on her for the first time since entering the room, sharp and assessing in a way that made her want to shrink back into the shadows. "The housemaid arranged medical treatment for the Duke of Ashbourne, without consulting anyone?" "She saved my life," Edmund said flatly, "while the rest of my family decided my life was not worth the inconvenience of staying to witness whether it ended or not." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, broken finally by the sound of footsteps in the hallway as Julian arrived, drawn by the raised voices, with Lady Eleanor trailing a step behind him in a manner that seemed, to Clara's watching eye, entirely too familiar and too comfortable for a woman merely accompanying her betrothed's family. "Edmund," Julian said, some genuine relief visible in his expression, despite the tension already thick in the room. "You are truly recovering. Thank heaven." "Thank Clara," Edmund corrected, and Julian's gaze flickered briefly to the housemaid standing quietly by the fire, an unreadable expression crossing his face before he looked away again. Lady Eleanor stepped further into the room, her eyes moving between Edmund and Clara with a calculation that Clara found herself disliking intensely, though she could not have said exactly why the other woman's attention unsettled her so deeply. "I am so pleased to see you well again, Edmund," Eleanor said, though her voice carried none of the warmth the words themselves suggested. "We must begin planning again for our future together, now that this dreadful ordeal is behind us." "Our future," Edmund repeated, and something in his tone made both Julian and Eleanor go very still. "I think, Eleanor, that you and I have very different understandings of what our future together looks like, or whether it exists at all." "Edmund," Lady Margaret said sharply, "this is not the moment for such conversations. You are still recovering. Your temper is understandably frayed after everything you have endured, but there is no need to say things in anger that you may later regret." "I am not speaking in anger, Mother. I am speaking with more clarity than I have possessed in years." Edmund's gaze moved deliberately between Julian and Eleanor, watching the color drain slowly from both their faces. "I know about the morning rides. I have known for some time now. Clara heard it from a Fenwick servant weeks ago, and I have had ample time since then to consider what it means, and what I intend to do about it." Julian's mouth opened, then closed again, no ready defense forming quickly enough to meet the accusation directly. It was Eleanor who finally spoke, her voice tight and defensive. They were simply rides, Edmund. Nothing more. You are ill, you are exhausted, and you are letting a servant's idle gossip poison your mind against people who love you. Clara has never once lied to me, Edmund said, his voice hardening further. In 2 months of caring for me alone, while the rest of you remained comfortably absent, she has never once told me anything but the plain truth, however difficult it was to hear. I cannot say the same for anyone else standing in this room. Lady Margaret's composure finally cracked, some genuine distress showing through the careful management she had maintained since entering. Edmund, please. Whatever has happened, whatever misunderstandings exist between you and Eleanor, this is not the way to address them, in front of the servants, in the heat of the moment. Let us all sit down, calmly, and discuss this like a family. A family, Edmund said, and a bitter edge in his voice made Clara's chest ache on his behalf. I have thought a great deal these past 2 months about what that word actually means. I used to believe it meant people who stayed, who showed up when things became difficult, who chose presence over comfort when someone they claimed to love was suffering. I have learned differently now. I have learned that the only person in this entire house who behaved like family, in the truest sense of that word, was never family at all by blood or by law. She was simply the one person who refused to leave. Lady Margaret's eyes moved slowly to Clara, standing quietly by the fire, and something complicated passed across her face. Not quite anger, not quite shame, but some uncomfortable mixture of both. You cannot possibly mean to suggest that a housemaid's loyalty outweighs the bonds of blood between a mother and her son. I mean to suggest exactly that, Edmund said, because it is the truth, and I am done pretending otherwise, simply to preserve everyone's comfort. The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, each accusation drawing a sharper response than the last, had Dr. Colton's scheduled visit not arrived at precisely that moment, his carriage pulling up the drive with a timing that felt almost providential. Mrs. Doyle appeared in the doorway to announce his presence, and the tension in the room broke just enough for Lady Margaret to withdraw, promising, in a voice still tight with unresolved distress, that they would continue this conversation later, when tempers had cooled and clearer heads could prevail. Julian left without another word, his expression troubled, while Eleanor lingered a moment longer, opening her mouth as though to offer some final defense before apparently thinking better of it and following the others from the room in stiff, wounded silence. When the door finally closed behind them, Edmund exhaled slowly, some of the rigid tension leaving his shoulders as Clara crossed the room to check the color in his face, worried the confrontation had cost him more strength than he could easily spare this early in his recovery. That was not wise, she said softly, kneeling beside his chair to take his pulse the way Dr. Colton had taught her, relieved to find it steady despite everything. Dr. Colton warned against excitement of any kind. Some things are worth the risk, Edmund said, reaching to cover her hand with his own, stilling her careful counting. I have spent 2 months lying in that bed, watching you give everything you had to keep me alive, while the people who should have been doing the same chose their own comfort instead. I will not go back to pretending that arrangement was acceptable, Clara, simply because they have finally returned to collect the recovered version of the son and brother they left behind to die. Clara said nothing, but she did not pull her hand away either, and when Dr. Colton entered a moment later to find them exactly like that, hands joined, something quietly unspoken passing between them, he had the good grace to say nothing about it at all, only proceeding with his examination as though the moment had never happened. Lady Margaret sought Clara out later that same evening, finding her alone in the linen room, folding fresh sheets for the guest wing now that the family had returned in full. She closed the door behind her with a deliberate quietness that immediately put Clara on guard, and for a long moment the older woman simply studied her, as though trying to understand something about the young housemaid that had eluded her for 17 years of shared residence under the same roof. You have changed things between us, Lady Margaret said finally, her voice carrying none of the warmth she usually reserved for addressing the staff, but none of the outright hostility Clara had braced herself for either. My son speaks of you now in ways I have never heard him speak of anyone, not even Eleanor, in the earliest, warmest days of their engagement. I only did what needed doing, my lady, Clara said carefully, setting down the sheet in her hands and folding her own hands instead, uncertain what was expected of her in this conversation. Someone had to care for him. I could not simply watch him suffer alone. No, Lady Margaret agreed, something almost like weariness entering her voice now. I understand that. I have had 2 months to sit with what I did, Clara, what all of us did, and I will not pretend to you that I am proud of the choices I made. I told myself I was protecting Julian, protecting the household, that removing us from the sickness was the sensible course a mother owed her remaining family. I did not let myself examine too closely what that choice truly meant for the son I was leaving behind. Clara said nothing, uncertain whether this admission was meant as apology or simply confession, and unwilling to offer forgiveness that was not fully hers to give on Edmund's behalf. "But I will tell you plainly," Lady Margaret continued, straightening slightly, some of her usual composure returning, "that whatever has grown between you and my son in these 2 months cannot continue as it has. He is the Duke of Ashbourne. You are a housemaid, however devoted, however invaluable your care has proven to be. There are boundaries in this world that exist for reasons beyond simple cruelty, Clara, and I would ask you to remember your place before matters proceed any further in a direction that can only end badly for you." "I have never forgotten my place, my lady," Clara said quietly, though something in her chest tightened painfully at the warning embedded in the words. "I have only tried to keep your son alive. Whatever else has happened between us, that was never my intention." "Intention matters little, once feeling has taken root," Lady Margaret said, not unkindly, though the words landed with their own particular weight. "I am not blind, Clara. I saw the way he looked at you this afternoon. I saw the way you looked back. I am telling you this not out of cruelty, but because I do not wish to see you hurt when this household inevitably reasserts the natural order that illness temporarily disrupted." She left without waiting for a response, and Clara stood alone in the linen room for a long while afterward, the folded sheets forgotten in her hands, turning Lady Margaret's warning over in her mind with a heaviness she could not easily shake. She had known, of course, on some level that had remained carefully unexamined through these long weeks of caregiving, that whatever was growing between herself and Edmund existed in defiance of every rule that governed the world they both lived in. Hearing it spoken aloud by his own mother, however, gave the warning a weight and reality it had not carried before. That night, when she brought Edmund his evening tincture, he noticed immediately that something weighed on her, his recovering strength allowing him an attentiveness to her moods that had not been possible in the earliest, most desperate weeks of his illness. "You are troubled," he said, watching her carefully as she measured the bitter medicine into its small glass. "Tell me what happened. I could see it in your face the moment you entered." Clara hesitated, uncertain whether repeating his mother's warning would help or harm the fragile understanding growing between them. But she had promised herself honesty above all else, and she found she could not abandon that promise now simply because the truth had become uncomfortable. "Your mother spoke with me this evening," she said carefully, handing him the glass. "She warned me against forgetting my place. She was not unkind about it, precisely, but she made her meaning very clear." Edmund's expression darkened, though he drank the tincture without complaint before setting the glass aside and reaching for her hand once more. "My mother has spent 2 months absent from this house while you kept me alive through sheer will and devotion, and her first act upon returning is to warn you away from me, as though the natural order she speaks of has earned any right to reassert itself here." "She is not entirely wrong, Edmund," Clara said softly, though it pained her to say it. "The world we live in does not easily forgive what has grown between us. I am a servant, you are a duke. Whatever we feel, however genuine it is, it cannot simply erase 17 years of difference in our positions." "It has already erased something far more important," Edmund said firmly, holding her gaze with a steadiness that had grown stronger with each week of his recovery. "It has shown me exactly who deserves my loyalty, my trust, and yes, my heart. And it was never going to be decided by titles or positions, not after everything these past 2 months have taught me about where true devotion actually lives. Let my mother worry about the natural order. I have already decided where I stand, Clara, and no warning, however well-intentioned, is going to change that now." The truth about Julian and Eleanor finally surfaced 3 days later, not through careful confrontation, but through the plain, unavoidable evidence of a letter left carelessly on the drawing-room table, addressed in Eleanor's hand to Julian, and signed with words that left no room whatsoever for innocent interpretation. It was Mrs. Doyle who found it while tidying the room for evening callers, and she carried it directly to Edmund rather than risk it falling into hands that might use it for gossip rather than truth. Edmund read it twice in the quiet of his room, his face growing paler with each line, before he finally set it aside and asked Clara to summon his mother, his brother, and his betrothed to the drawing room within the hour. Clara delivered the message with a steady voice that betrayed none of the nervous energy building in her chest, understanding that whatever happened in that drawing room would reshape the household in ways none of them could yet fully predict. She helped Edmund dress properly for the first time in 2 months, choosing a coat that fit his still recovering frame, and walked beside him down the stairs he had not descended since the night he collapsed, his hand gripping the banister tightly but his steps growing steadier with each one. The family had already assembled by the time they entered the drawing room, Lady Margaret seated near the window with visible tension in her posture, Julian standing near the fireplace with his arms crossed defensively, and Eleanor perched on the edge of a chair, her face pale in a way that suggested she already suspected the reason for this sudden summons. Edmund did not sit. He stood in the center of the room, Clara a careful step behind him, and withdrew the letter from his coat pocket, holding it up for all of them to see without yet reading its contents aloud. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, looking directly at Eleanor as he spoke. "Though I confess I did not expect to find such definitive proof of what I had only suspected until now." Eleanor's face drained of what little color remained as recognition dawned, and Julian's arms uncrossed slowly, his own expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror as he understood what his brother held. "Edmund, I can explain," Eleanor began, rising from her chair, but he cut her off with a raised hand and a coldness in his voice that silenced the room entirely. "I do not require an explanation. The letter explains itself quite thoroughly. What I require now is honesty, finally, after 2 months of half-truths and careful evasions from everyone in this family, except the one person who never once lied to me." His gaze moved briefly to Clara, before returning to Eleanor and Julian. "How long has this been happening?" The silence stretched painfully before Julian finally spoke, his voice low and ashamed. "Since Fenwick. Since the 2nd week. Perhaps the 3rd. It began innocently, I swear it. Simple rides to occupy the hours while we all waited to learn whether you would live or die. I do not know precisely when it became something more, but by the time I understood what was happening, I did not know how to undo it, or how to face you with the truth of what I had done. So instead you rode out with my betrothed morning after morning, while I lay here believing myself entirely abandoned by everyone I trusted," Edmund said. "That clarity would have been kinder than the silence you chose instead." Lady Margaret rose from her seat now, her composure finally breaking entirely. "Edmund, please, this serves no purpose beyond wounding everyone further. Whatever has happened between Julian and Eleanor, it does not change the fact that you are recovering, that we are, despite everything, still a family who can find a way forward together." "Can we?" Edmund asked, turning to face his mother fully. "Because from where I have stood these past 2 months, watching this family from the isolation of a sickbed, I have seen very little evidence of the bond you keep insisting exists between us. I have seen absence, Mother. I have seen convenience prioritized over loyalty, comfort chosen over presence, at the exact moment when presence mattered more than anything else in the world. I do not know how to simply forget that, however much you might wish me to." Eleanor, finding her voice again despite the tears now visible on her face, stepped forward with something like desperation in her expression. "Edmund, I did not intend for any of this. I was frightened, watching you decline, uncertain whether I would spend the rest of my life as a widow before I had even properly become a wife." Julian offered comfort, nothing more, at least at first, and somewhere along the way that comfort became something I should have resisted far more firmly than I did. "I understand fear, Eleanor," Edmund said, his voice softening only slightly. "What I cannot understand, what I cannot forgive, is choosing to seek comfort in my own brother's company, rather than simply being honest with me about your doubts. If you no longer wish to marry a dying man, you had only to say so plainly. I would have released you from our engagement without a moment's hesitation, and spared us both this particular humiliation." He turned then, deliberately, and reached for Clara's hand, drawing her forward to stand beside him rather than a step behind, a small gesture that carried enormous weight in front of his assembled family. "I am formally ending my engagement to Lady Eleanor Vance, effective immediately. The circumstances make this decision simple rather than difficult, whatever complications it may create for the family's standing in society." Lady Margaret's mouth opened, some protest already forming, but Edmund continued before she could speak, his grip on Clara's hand tightening slightly as though drawing strength from her presence. "And I want it understood, clearly, by everyone in this room, that Clara Whitfield is the reason I am standing here at all, recovered and alive, rather than in a grave on the family plot. She found the physician who saved my life, when the rest of you had already accepted my death as the likely outcome. She sat beside me every night for 2 months, when the rest of you found reasons to remain elsewhere. Whatever debt this family owes for my survival, it is owed entirely to her, and I do not intend to let that debt go unacknowledged, simply because acknowledging it makes certain people in this room uncomfortable." Julian, still standing near the fireplace, spoke quietly into the tense silence that followed. "What do you intend to do, Edmund? About Clara? About all of this?" Edmund looked down at Clara, and something passed between them, a question asked silently and answered just as silently. before he turned back to face his family with a certainty that had been building in him for weeks, finally given permission to speak itself aloud. "I intend to marry her," he said simply. "If she will have me." The room erupted into a chorus of reactions. Lady Margaret's sharp intake of breath, Julian's stunned silence, Eleanor's quiet, bitter laugh at the irony of losing her position to the very housemaid who had cared for the man she had been so quick to abandon in his illness. Clara herself stood frozen, her heart pounding, uncertain whether the words she had just heard were truly real, or some fevered imagining born of exhaustion and hope tangled too closely together. "Edmund," she said softly, aware of every eye in the room fixed on her now, "you cannot mean that. The scandal alone would follow you for the rest of your life. Your family, society, everyone would. I have spent 2 months learning exactly how little society's approval is worth, when measured against genuine loyalty and love," Edmund said, turning fully to face her now, seeming to forget entirely the audience still watching them both. "I do not care what scandal follows. I care that you are the only person who never once left my side, who never once lied to me, who gave me back a life I had already resigned myself to losing. If that is not worth every ounce of scandal society can produce, then I do not know what is." Clara felt tears rising, unbidden, and did not try to stop them this time. "I never expected anything from you, Edmund. I never did any of it hoping for this." "I know," he said softly. "That is precisely why I am asking now, with my whole heart, rather than out of any sense of obligation. Marry me, Clara. Not because you saved my life, though you did. Because somewhere in these past 2 months, without either of us quite meaning for it to happen, you became the truest home I have ever known." Lady Margaret, still visibly shaken by the swift unraveling of every careful plan she had once held for her son's future, finally spoke into the emotional silence that followed his proposal. "Edmund, please, consider what you are doing. This is not a decision to make in the heat of gratitude and recent illness. Give it time. Give yourself space to think clearly, once the strangeness of your recovery has settled." "I have had 2 months of nothing but time, Mother," Edmund said, not unkindly, but with an unshakable firmness. 2 months lying in that bed with nothing to do but think, clearly and honestly, about what truly mattered in my life. I have never been more certain of anything than I am of this. Julian, still standing quietly by the fireplace, finally stepped forward, his expression carrying something that looked almost like relief, as though his brother's decisive certainty offered him permission to release some of the guilt he had been carrying since the letter's discovery. "I owe you an apology, Edmund, far greater than anything I have offered so far. I was a coward when you needed a brother, and I compounded that cowardice by betraying you in the worst possible way while you fought for your own survival. I do not expect forgiveness easily, or perhaps at all, but I want you to know that I am glad, truly glad, that you have found something real in all of this, even if I have no right to claim any credit for it." Edmund studied his brother for a long moment before nodding once, a small gesture that did not erase 2 months of hurt but offered, perhaps, the beginning of a path back toward some restored version of brotherhood, built slowly over time rather than assumed as an unquestioned birthright. Eleanor left the house within the week, her engagement formally dissolved, her reputation in the county forever altered by the manner of its ending, though whispers suggested she and Julian intended to weather that particular storm together, whatever form their future relationship might eventually take. Lady Margaret, for her part, needed considerably longer to accept the new shape of her son's life, though the steady, quiet dignity with which Clara conducted herself in the weeks that followed slowly wore away at the older woman's resistance, until grudging tolerance began, very gradually, to soften into something closer to genuine respect. Clara Whitfield married Edmund Ashbourne, Duke of Ashbourne, in a small ceremony the following spring, in the same house where she had once carried linens up servants' stairs, now walking down its grand main staircase in a gown of pale silver silk, toward a man who had once been left to die alone, and now stood waiting for her with a life fully, completely restored. The county talked of little else for months, scandal and admiration mixing in equal measure, but neither Edmund nor Clara paid much attention to any of it. In the weeks between the proposal and the wedding, Clara found herself navigating a strange new existence, no longer quite a housemaid, but not yet fully accepted as the future Duchess of Ashbourne, caught in the uncertain space between 2 worlds that had never before been asked to overlap. Mrs. Doyle, to Clara's quiet surprise, proved to be one of her steadiest sources of support through this transition, treating her with the same brisk practicality she always had, refusing to let the strangeness of the situation unsettle the smooth running of the household. "You earned this," Mrs. Doyle told her plainly, one afternoon while helping Clara select fabric for a new wardrobe befitting her coming position. "I watched you climb those stairs every night for 2 months, when it would have been far easier to stay in your own bed and let the family handle their own affairs however carelessly they chose to. Whatever anyone else in this county has to say about it, you did not steal this life. You built it, night after night, with nothing but your own 2 hands and your own stubborn heart." Grace Fenmore, too, remained a steady presence through those transitional weeks, continuing her visits even after Dr. Colton officially discharged Edmund from close medical supervision, though the visits now carried more the character of friendship than professional obligation. She taught Clara, in those final weeks, the particular etiquette expected of a woman soon to run a great house, patiently correcting small missteps with the same quiet, unshowy competence she had once used to teach bandaging and pulse-taking. "You will make a fine duchess," Grace told her one evening, watching Clara pour tea with newly practiced grace in the drawing room, where, only months before, she had stood as an invisible servant, refilling cups no one thanked her for. "Better than most born to it, if you want my honest opinion. You have already proven you know what genuine care looks like, which is more than most of the great ladies in this county could ever claim to understand." Julian's path toward redemption proved slower and more difficult than his initial apology had suggested it might be. He remained at Ashbourne Hill through the following months, watching from a careful distance as his brother's recovery continued to strengthen, offering small gestures of atonement that Edmund accepted with cautious, incremental grace rather than immediate forgiveness. It was Clara, in the end, who helped bridge some of the remaining distance between the brothers, gently encouraging Edmund to remember that Julian's failure had been born of fear and immaturity rather than any deeper cruelty, and that some relationships, however damaged, were still worth the slow, patient work of rebuilding. "You forgave people far less deserving than your own brother," she told Edmund one evening, as they sat together in the garden he was finally strong enough to walk through unassisted. "You forgave me my presumption in summoning a physician without permission. You can find a way to forgive Julian his cowardice, in time, if you choose to." "You make it sound simple," Edmund said, though there was no real argument in his voice, only the particular fondness that had grown between them through months of honest, unguarded conversation. "It is not simple," Clara agreed, "but very little worth doing ever is." Lady Margaret's own reconciliation with her son and his choice took longer still, built slowly through 100 small moments, rather than any single dramatic turning point. She watched Clara manage the household staff with a natural authority that seemed to surprise her more each week, watched her care for Edmund with a devotion that never once wavered even now that the crisis had passed and easier days had come. By the time the wedding invitations were sent, Lady Margaret had stopped voicing objections entirely, though Clara suspected the older woman's full acceptance would take considerably longer to arrive than her outward compliance suggested. The wedding itself, when it finally came, was smaller than tradition might have demanded for a duke's marriage, a deliberate choice both Edmund and Clara had insisted upon despite Lady Margaret's initial protests. They wanted no grand spectacle built around a scandal the county would gossip about regardless of how much money was spent trying to dress it in respectability. They wanted only the people who had truly mattered through the darkest months of Edmund's illness. Grace Fenmore seated near the front in her best dress, Mrs. Doyle dabbing quietly at her eyes throughout the ceremony, Dr. Colton standing near the back with the same measured, thoughtful expression he had worn during every examination that had slowly, carefully, brought Edmund back from the edge of death. A year passed before the county fully stopped whispering about the Duke of Ashbourne and the housemaid he had married, and by then, the whispers had softened into something closer to admiration than scandal, helped along by the plain, undeniable evidence of how well the new Duchess managed her position. Clara had never forgotten the years she spent below stairs, and she carried that memory into every decision she made as mistress of Ashbourne Hill. She raised the wages of the household staff within her first month in the role, insisted on proper meals and reasonable hours for every servant who worked beneath her roof, and made certain that no one in her employment would ever again be left, as Edmund once had been, to face illness or hardship without someone willing to stay close through the difficult hours. Edmund's health continued its slow, steady improvement under Dr. Colton's ongoing care, and by the second spring after his recovery began, he was strong enough to ride again, to walk the full length of the estate grounds without tiring, to resume many of the duties and pleasures his illness had once stolen from him entirely. He never lost the particular gratitude that had shaped him during those 2 desperate months, and he spoke often, to anyone who would listen, of the housemaid who had refused to leave his side when everyone else in his life had found reasons to stay away. Julian's redemption, slow as it had been, eventually found its own quiet resolution. He left Ashbourne Hill within the year, taking up residence on a smaller property the family owned in a neighboring county. And though his relationship with Eleanor Vance never fully recovered from the scandal of its beginning, the two eventually married in a modest ceremony that drew far less attention than Edmund and Clara's had. Edmund attended, at Clara's gentle urging, offering his brother a measure of forgiveness that, while incomplete, represented a genuine effort toward healing the wounds their family's crisis had opened between them. Lady Margaret remained at Ashbourne Hill, her relationship with Clara evolving gradually from wary tolerance into something that occasionally, on the best days, resembled real warmth. She never fully abandoned her belief that the world ran more smoothly when everyone remained within their proper place, but she could not deny, watching her son thrive under his young wife's steady care, that some exceptions to that belief had proven themselves entirely worth making. Grace Fenmore continued her work as the county's most trusted nurse, though she visited Ashbourne Hill often enough that the staff had long since stopped treating her arrival as anything but the visit of an old and valued friend. Clara made certain, in the years that followed, that Grace's skill and dedication were properly recognized and compensated, establishing a small fund at the local hospital in her honor, a gesture Grace accepted with the same quiet, unshowy gratitude she had always shown toward the young woman she had once trained to read a failing pulse in the dark hours before dawn. Mrs. Doyle remained head housekeeper at Ashbourne Hill until her own retirement several years later, and it was Clara who ensured she spent those final working years in comfort, and her retirement years after in a cottage on the estate grounds, close enough to visit whenever either woman wished for the company of the other. The bond forged between them during those desperate 2 months of Edmund's illness never faded, even as their formal roles in the household shifted and changed around them. Dr. Colton's reputation grew steadily in the years following Edmund's recovery, his unconventional methods gaining wider acceptance as word spread of the Duke of Ashbourne, given up for lost by one physician, restored to full health by another, willing to look beyond the easy, hopeless answer. He remained the family physician for the rest of his career, a fixture at Ashbourne Hill through every illness, every birth, every ordinary crisis that visits any family across the passing years. Edmund and Clara had their first child within 2 years of their marriage, a daughter with her father's steady gray eyes and, everyone agreed, her mother's fierce and stubborn heart. They named her after no one in particular, choosing instead a name that belonged fully to her own future rather than any inherited expectation, and Edmund often said, watching his wife hold their daughter beside the same fireplace where he had once lain dying and alone, that he could not imagine a life more different, or more precious, than the one he had almost lost entirely. He kept, tucked away in a drawer of his writing desk, the small leather notebook Clara had once used to record his pulse and his breathing through those long, uncertain weeks of treatment, the careful handwriting growing steadier and more confident with each passing page as her skill and her hope had grown alongside it. He took it out sometimes, in quiet moments, and read through those early entries, the desperate, careful measurements of a life, hanging in delicate balance, and felt each time the same overwhelming gratitude that had first moved him to ask for her hand in that crowded, tense drawing room. Clara, for her part, never forgot the fear of those early nights, sitting alone beside a dying man's bed while the rest of his family slept comfortably 40 miles away. But she chose, in the years that followed, to let that fear transform into something purposeful rather than bitter, using her position and her influence to ensure that no one under her care, servant or family member alike, would ever again face illness or hardship without someone willing to stay close through the darkest hours. The great house on Ashbourne Hill, once a place of cold formality and careful distance between master and servant, slowly became known throughout the county as a household of genuine warmth, where loyalty was valued above title, and where the Duchess herself was known to sit through the night beside any member of her household who fell seriously ill, a habit she never abandoned no matter how many years passed or how settled her position became. Visitors to the estate sometimes remarked on this peculiar habit of the Duchess, this willingness to set aside the formal boundaries her position might have allowed her to hide behind, and Clara always answered the same way when asked about it, with a small, private smile that spoke of memories only she and Edmund fully understood. "I know what it means," she would say, "to be the only one who stays. I do not intend to forget that lesson, for as long as I live." Eleanor Vance, in her own quiet way, found a kind of peace with the path her life had taken, however unconventional its beginning had been. She and Julian settled into their smaller estate with a modesty neither had expected to value so deeply after growing up amid the grandeur of Ashbourne Hill and its neighboring properties. Freed from the weight of a title she had once pursued more out of ambition than genuine affection, Eleanor discovered in herself a capacity for simple contentment she had never had reason to explore before, and she wrote to Clara occasionally, brief, careful letters that spoke of a friendship slowly, cautiously rebuilding itself from the wreckage of their earlier history. Clara answered each letter with the same patient honesty she had once offered Edmund through his darkest nights, understanding that forgiveness, like healing, rarely arrived all at once, but built itself instead through small, consistent gestures repeated over time. By the time their children were old enough to play together during rare family visits, the old wounds between the two women had scarred over into something that no longer ached with every remembered slight, transformed instead into a wary but genuine respect neither had expected to find on the other side of such a painful beginning. Dr. Prescott, whose grim predictions had so nearly proven the final word on Edmund's story, visited Ashbourne Hill only once more in the years that followed, called upon for an unrelated matter concerning one of the tenant families on the estate. He examined Edmund from a polite distance during that visit, clearly uncertain how to reconcile the recovered, vigorous man before him with the patient he had once quietly prepared for death, and he left that day with a humility Clara had never before seen him display, a quiet acknowledgement, though never spoken aloud, that certainty in medicine was a far more fragile thing than his early confidence had once suggested. The servants of Ashbourne Hill, in the years following Clara's ascension to Duchess, told her story often among themselves, embellishing certain details with each retelling, the way all good stories eventually become embellished, until the young housemaid who had once carried linens up narrow servant stairs took on, in their telling, something close to the shape of legend. New staff arriving at the great house were told, within their first week of service, about the Duchess who had once been one of them, who had defied every expectation of her station to save a dying man's life, and who never once, in all her years as mistress of the house, forgot where she had come from, or the debt she still felt she owed to anyone who served faithfully and without complaint. Edmund, watching his wife move through the great halls of Ashbourne Hill with the same quiet purpose she had once brought to the sick room where he lay dying, often thought back to the night his family's carriages had rolled away down the gravel drive, leaving him alone with nothing but a fading fire and an untouched pitcher of water. He had believed, in his darkest hours, that abandonment was simply the natural order of things, that blood and title guaranteed nothing when tested against genuine hardship. Clara had taught him otherwise, not through grand speeches or dramatic declarations, but through the simple, unglamorous persistence of showing up, night after night, when showing up cost her something real, and offered her, in return, no certainty of reward. It was that lesson, more than any other, that Edmund carried forward into his own long tenure as Duke of Ashbourne, shaping the way he treated every person who came within his influence, family and servant alike. He became known, in time, as a landlord, unusually generous toward his tenants, an employer unusually attentive to the well-being of his staff, a man who understood, in a way few of his peers ever fully grasped, that loyalty freely given deserved to be met with loyalty freely returned. And so the story of the sick Duke of Ashbourne and the housemaid who refused to leave his side became, in time, something more than county gossip or passing scandal. It became a quiet legend told among the servants of great houses throughout the region, a reminder that titles and blood did not always determine where true loyalty could be found, and that sometimes, in the darkest and most desperate hours, it was the person least expected to stay who proved, in the end, to be the only one who truly mattered.